I've been thinking about how the peace movement should be opposing wars. And I started thinking about this a lot at the 10-year mark in Iraq, when I discovered that if I looked closely at what had happened to Iraq, most people didn't have any notion of what had been done. A majority of Americans believes that the war benefited Iraq and that the United States suffered. And so for all of those years in which you had a majority of Americans saying, end this war, which was great, it was absolutely the right thing to say, many people were saying, end this act of philanthropy. They weren't saying, end this one-sided slaughter, end this genocide, end this war as it existed in reality. They were saying, we can't afford to help the Iraqis this much. And when you have a majority say, don't invade Syria, which is absolutely the right thing to say, a lot of people are saying that for more or less the right reasons. A lot of people are saying we can't afford to help those Syrians right now the way we helped the Libyans and the Afghans and the Iraqis. When you read about the war deaths in Iraq, and they're all Americans, you don't grasp that those were 0.3% of the deaths in Iraq. Wow. When you read about damage in Iraq and reconstruction and the country being rebuilt, you don't grasp that Iraq lost a greater number of people dead and a greater percentage of its population dead than has been imposed on almost any other country in the history of the world. More than the United States in its civil war, which we call our bloodiest, most deadly war, as if Vietnamese and Filipinos and Iraqis don't bleed. More than the United States in World War II, or England, or France, or Japan in World War II. One of the worst things to happen to a nation ever. And many times that number injured, and many times that number traumatized, and many times that number made refugees. The structure of the country absolutely eliminated. The education system, the healthcare system, the environmental destruction, never to be undone. Right? A country destroyed. And we don't grasp that, in large part because we talk so much about the financial cost, as we should, about the cost in U.S. lives, as we should, about the fact that the war is not being won, as we should, about the fact that it's not being strategically fought, about the fact that Iraq had no ties to 9/11 and the weapons weren't there and so forth. But to a certain extent, these were the wrong things for us to be saying, right? If Iraq had all of those weapons, that was no excuse for a war. If Syria has chemical weapons, that is no excuse for a war. We've got more weapons than anybody else. Nobody has the right to bomb us. If Iraq had been involved in 9/11, which people will make a case for Afghanistan, that was no excuse for a war. If the war was expensive, they'll find ways to make it less expensive. This is the purpose of the drones, one of them. And we get all these groups on board with saying, stop the military waste. I'm against military efficiency. I'm not against military waste. Right? And we get all the leftist progressive groups saying, jobs not cuts. We want cuts. We want cuts. I don't care if, we want investment in people and in human needs, and lots of cuts, and moving the money to the right place. We talk about the U.S. deaths and the veterans suffering, and that's good, and we should. But we have to talk about the fact that the wars are one-sided slaughters, that they're murder. We have to make that moral case. And I spend a lot of time making the case that the war was based on lies. And I think, we should. I think, we need the combination of arguments. We need to tell people the economic trade-offs. We need to tell people they're being lied to. But we have to tell them that it's mass murder. We don't lose people by making that argument. Americans don't want to murder children. Make the economic argument too, but make that one. And so I actually wrote a book called War is a Lie, where I tried to categorize all the major types of lies that have been used over the centuries to support wars. And I intended that as a handbook in preparation for the next looming war and the one after that. And I continue to believe that's a useful thing. But I think we really ought to have been saying we don't want to murder men, women, and children more than we did. And it's illegal, and all the other reasons. And so when I looked at the peace movement in the 1920s, I was struck by how much it was a moral case. I mean, how much it resembled the original abolitionists of slavery in England, who were talking about aiding people unlike themselves, far away, whom they'd never seen, making sacrifices for those people, and succeeded in convincing people in England that that was a just cause. The 1920s peace movement in this country looked more like that than it looked like the current one. It was a movement against murdering human beings. It had the economic arguments and all our other arguments, but that was overwhelmingly the case that was made. And it was made by every type of secular group, but every type of religious group in this country as well. All of the religious denominations were on board. I mean, this was a incredibly mainstream movement. Bankers, lawyers, Republicans, Democrats, university presidents, the women's groups that had in large part sold out the peace movement on World War I, but now had won the right to vote, much good it did them, and were now focused on ending war. The parents' teachers associations, the veterans groups, the military groups, the schools, every church in everybody on board with this thing. It was a visionary movement. It was an inspiring movement. It had virtually nothing to do with elections, virtually nothing to do with partisanship. Cindy and Claire and a bunch of us were down in Dallas this week or last week, and we were standing outside of the library, and all the folks in their Sunday best came streaming out, and this woman came up and started screaming at me, and screaming essentially, because we had this big crowd of anti-war banners and flags and props and flyers, and why don't you protest Obama? Why don't you ever do this to Obama? You all went away and don't protest Obama. And I was wearing a shirt that said, "Arrest Bush and Obama." And so I said, "Ma'am, can you read?" And so then she took a different approach and said, "Well, if Obama does it, why don't you like it? Why don't you support it?" Because this is how people think. They think you're for Bush or you're for Obama. Right? We have to be against murder. This is where we have to be. And so you look back at this movement in the 1920s, and there was never any thought, there was never an ounce of energy devoted to figuring out who would save us in 3 years. Who should we elect to? There was an effort to move the entire country, all the political parties. I mean, this was a movement that got endorsed by the four big political parties, including the two really big ones, and to move the people who were in office to do what needed to be done. So you had this Republican lawyer from Minnesota, former head of the American Bar Association, Frank Kellogg, who went in less than a year from cursing peace activists, in between his fits of drunkenness, to telling his wife, I think I really could win a Nobel Peace Prize. I think I can do it. And working night and day, not along the model of Obama, Kissinger, or the European Union to kill people for a Nobel Peace Prize, but actually to work for a Nobel Peace Prize, to work to bring the nations of the world together to ban war. And so, and he got a Nobel Peace Prize, and he deserved it, and he should have, and we should impeach Bush and Obama and prosecute wrongdoing, but we should reward good behavior, and we should like it when public officials are motivated by dangling prizes out there for them, when they are the right things for the right reasons. This movement was educational. I mean, it was mass education. It was endless flyering and speaking and publishing books and going into schools and holding public events. It was a movement that, there was tax resistance, and there were groups that at least said, put on there, this is being paid under protest and so forth. But I've not read any accounts. Somebody no doubt knows more about it than I do in this room. I've not read any accounts that suggest tax resistance was a big part of the movement. Neither, to my knowledge, was civil disobedience. This was a movement of mass petition gathering, mass public event holding, mass recruitment of individuals and groups to sign letters, and endless lobbying, and of illegal lobbying of foreign governments and U.S. peace activists going over to France and ghostwriting proposals for the French foreign minister, Aristide Briand, to put in the press, and then writing responses in the U.S. newspapers and doing this sort of ventriloquist act until the actual governments got on board with the proposal. It was a movement that thought very, very long term, that thought we're going to die working on this and other generations are going to continue, and wasn't terribly disturbed by that in many cases. There was not a lot of anger that war hadn't ended yet and they'd been working on it for a whole month and so forth, as one might expect.